So good morning and Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach. We're going to begin with the blessing for studying Torah. I will share my screen with you. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with words of Torah. Somebody like to read this beginning?
I will, if you can, if you can hear me.
Yes, can hear you.
Okay. Listen, you heavens, and I will speak. Hear, you earth, the words of my mouth. Let my teaching fall like rain, and my words descend like dew, like showers on new grass, like abundant rain on tender plants. I will proclaim the name of the Lord. My voice isn't good in the morning. Oh, praise the greatness of our God. He is the rock. His works are perfect and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he.
Okay, let's just stop there. First, we have Jonathan Sacks's commentary on those first couple of verses. Give ear, O heaven, let me speak. Let the earth hear the words I utter. May my discourse come down as the rain, my speech distill as the dew. So Moses asked the heavens and the earth to listen, to give ear to what he's about to say. But the world, of course, has no ears. Therefore, the real focus of Moses' address is the people of Israel. It is we who are to pay heed to his promise. To listen is an important imperative in our tradition. Although most people think that sight is the dominant sense, we say, Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel. Why hear? Perhaps it's because sight is so overpowering that what we see is hard to deny. Hearing, however, is more subtle. To truly hear means taking time to listen and then to reflect. To hear means making an effort, for God's voice rarely overpowers. In his final oration, Moses reminds the people to pay greater heed to the sense of hearing. In essence, to listen more attentively as we begin a new year, the sound of the shofar is still fresh in our ears. We would do well to do the same. Now, this is because normally this is read right around the high holidays. What in our everyday lives do we hear? Do we listen to the young or ignore them? Do we take time to hear the stories of our elderly or only pay attention to those of our own generation? Do we hear the pleas of the hungry, not only those across the oceans, but also those at just a few blocks away? Is it God's voice we hear or only the sigh of the wind? So Judaism really puts an emphasis on hearing, right? And not just hearing like, oh, it's going to go through my ears, but listening, right? We say, Shema Yisrael, listen, Israel, pay attention. For those of you who came to I had a session about miracles in Hanukkah, and it's up on in our YouTube channel. So if anybody wants to see it, and I talked about how important it is to pay attention, right? We have blessings all over the place, and so often we just don't notice them because we're too busy. We're too, focused on what we need to get done. And I think that's what the mitzvot are really about. We were talking about the mitzvot. They're about being attentive, being mindful about what we do and how we do things, and not to take things for granted, and not to, eat something and just say, this tastes good, but to think about how it is that you came to eat this piece of food. How did it grow, and who harvested it, and who packaged it, and who put it in the store, and all of those essential workers that we're starting to really value a lot more now than we ever did before. So here again, it's interesting. Jonathan Sacks says that he doesn't think that Moses is actually asking the heavens and the earth to listen, but I think that is there as well, that they are to be witnesses, witnesses to this agreement that's being made with the Israelites, right? You're supposed to have this covenant with God, and Yeah, so they're really being called as witnesses as though in a court. And in Jewish law, you need two witnesses. So it's heaven and earth. So it's also the range of everything in between. So actually, you can think of that environmentally for one. Like if we don't listen to the earth's needs, as witnesses, they will say, hey, you know what? Time for some coronavirus, right? I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I did read something about how we've encroached on the habitat of animals. And so things that normally would not be in our lives are now in our lives, among many other issues. Oh, I like your Leonard Cohen t-shirt, sweatshirt. Yeah, I love that line. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Perfect for Hanukkah. Perfect. Hi, Doug. Good morning. Hi, Rosalie. And Suzanne. Anybody have any comments before we go back to the handout?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I think some operative words are listen attentively. In training as a counselor, we are to listen actively, which applies here, not merely hear, but to understand. So that takes
Absolutely.
reflection
Yes.
and listening more than talking.
Exactly. When it says hear, H-E-A-R, it's really listen, pay attention. Don't just let these words, and again, comparing God's words to do or to rain, and that's very softly penetrating a rock, right? And we know that water can erode a rock, but it takes a very, very long time. And so we have to allow God's words to penetrate. Well, it's not going to necessarily happen in one flash, although maybe occasionally there's a thunderstorm and, you recognize divinity around you, but otherwise it's a slow process of training ourselves, right? To pay attention, to be grateful. The rabbis say you're supposed to recite 100 blessings a day. And that really develops gratitude. I was thinking about that on my walk this morning. I thought I should do this every day. Maybe not 100, but I'll start with 3, and really it can change your whole physiological makeup to practice gratitude. Okay, so we're gonna go on.
It's amazing how quickly they add up if you just do the one for using the bathroom or for before eating. I mean, right
yeah,
there,
you do your 100 right there, right?
Right there, that should get you, well past a dozen.
That's funny. Okay, so this is Rabbi Erwin Zeplowitz. On a spiritual level, the heavens may just be asked collectively to hear ha'azinu, but we on earth are challenged to hear with understanding. That's exactly what you just said, Felice. That the earth, our loved ones, and life itself are God's gift to us. We are challenged to hear God's presence in our lives, Shema. We're challenged to listen to the sacred wonder of every aspect of life. Hearing God's presence means going to the core of our being to become the person that God has enabled us and wants us to be. Namely, listening to the best and noblest parts of our inner self. So, if you have a hard time understanding what God is, and you don't want to be focused on a being like a very large old man or something, just think about what's noble and best in yourself. That's your divinity, your spark of divinity. And we all need to not only pay attention to the blessings around us, but the ones within us as well. And we don't take enough time to do that. Can we hear God calling from within? God calls out signals to us through our very heartbeat. God is our host through every breath, through every bit of nourishment we take. And remember, Ruach Elohim, the breath of God, is supposed to be what animated us to become human beings, right? From a bone or a rib or something. Is God the whisper of our conscience or a moment of awe and discovery? At times, God's presence is the inner silent certainty of a presence, as testified to by Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. The watchword of our faith is not Ha'azinu Yisrael, but rather Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, in order to teach us to listen with openness and receptivity. God calls us at every moment of our lives, opening us to all kinds of inner forces, feelings, and sparks of insight. May we, in the spirit of this week's Torah portion, Ha'azinu, identify one of the voices calling to us as the voice of God, which has called to us since our birth. In so doing, we will be recalling the words of the Yiddish poet H. Levick, who wrote, "A voice calls out, you must. Must what? Oh, voice, explain. Instead of an answer, I hear that call again. I peer behind the door. I dash at every wall. I search though no one strange has sent that call. I've known them all my life, the caller and the call." So any thoughts about any of this, about how we recognize the divinity? One of the things I was talking about in my Hanukkah Miracles class is that this is, of course, the time of greatest darkness. And so we light candles, right? And there was a dispute between Hillel and Shammai about what order to light them in. So Hillel says first 1, then 2, then 3, and that's what we do. Shammai says start with 8 and go down to 1. They try to figure out what the reasons are. One is that Hanukkah is Sukkot in December, and during Sukkot you bring a lot more sacrifices at the beginning than at the end. There's a diminishing number. And also that if you had enough oil for 8 days, then you would have 8 candles and the oil would diminish to the point where you could only do 1 at the end. But I think a deeper way to understand that is, how do you find the lightness in the dark? Whether the dark is outside, the political, economic, sociological situation of the world, or whether it's darkness within you because you're feeling, down for one reason or another. And how do you find that spark there? Which, for the Kabbalists, the mystics of our tradition, believe that every piece of matter, including us, has a spark of divinity. And every time we do a mitzvah, we release that spark. That's a metaphor. It's not like we, really, if I bless my phone, that sparks are going to go up to God. But the idea is a mitzvah releases holiness into the world. So,
Rabbi?
Yes, please.
We oddly had this discussion yesterday with a lot of 8th graders. I had our band director was doing a bunch of Hanukkah songs and wanted me to speak via Zoom to all the several different periods of 8th graders, and talking about Hanukkah and what it means and everything. And this one kid, it was really cute, said, "Well, I don't understand. Why don't you just light up all the candles on the first night?" And this girl said, I have an answer. And I went, yes. And she said, because it's scary. And I said, it's scary. And she said, yes, when you first start to light up, when it's so dark, when you're in such a bad place, or when things might be bad, like we have with COVID or other things that are happening, you go in really slowly with just a little bit of light because you're not sure what you're going to see.
Wow.
And then you add more and more light as the days go on because you're not scared anymore. And I'm going, voila, there it is. That's really
brilliant.
cool.
Brilliant. From an 8th grader yet.
From an 8th grader. So I wanted to share that. And
Thank you.
Yeah.
It is true. It is true that too much light is too awesome, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. I mean, she's right that, sometimes you need to do little by little. It's like people say, oh, it's so hard to observe Shabbat. Well, start with 1 hour, then do 3, and do it little by little. So that's really a brilliant insight.
Mm-hmm.
She'll go far.
Rabbi,
Yes, please.
I had a chance to sort of reflect on this. Thank you for sending it to me in advance. So to me, there's the words being to become, the person God wants you to be, to me is existentialism.
Mm-hmm.
To get into some, quasi philosophy. And listening to the best from paragraph 1 in our inner self. So it's telling us to self-actualize as much as we can, raising ourselves to try and be, although Judaism is doing, but being and doing.
Yeah, good. So yeah, I mean, it's about doing. So as you do, you become something else, or you become more of who you are. There's this story, I'm sure Jason knows the story about Zushia, who is a sage, you know, really, really smart and all that. And he's about to die and he starts crying. And his students say to him, "Why are you crying? You've studied so much Torah. I mean, you know, you're gonna definitely go into the world to come and, you know, have a great afterlife." He says, "That's not why I'm crying." Well, are you crying because you weren't like Abraham? No, that's not the reason. Well, are you crying because you weren't like Moses? He said, "No, I'm worried that when I go up to heaven and God asks me about my life, he's going to say, 'Why weren't you more like Zushia?'" In other words, you have to be who you are and fulfill what your inner calling is all about. And that's a way I think we can think about releasing divinity or holiness into the world, because we're all doing what our talents offer us. So that, which is why I always encourage people to follow their heart. Of course, we have to be somewhat realistic as well. I mean, we also have to pay bills, but you don't want to completely suppress the things you love, right? You need to take the time, whether it's to do gardening or play the violin or whatever it is. But that's, you know, in Judaism, we're expected to be who we are, not like, don't try to be like Moses or Abraham. Be like you.
It's that question that was one of the two infamous questions throughout life. Who we are we the real or the ideal?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that when I was reading this, about how, you know, God's always calling us, and, you know, Platonic philosophy, where, you know, I think you have to try to remember all the things you knew once upon a time. And actually, there's a story also in the Midrash somewhere about that babies, I think, are born with knowledge of everything, and then I think they get kissed by an angel or something, and then they have to relearn everything during their life. You know, Sisyphus's rock. Although hopefully when you get to the top, you don't have to start all the way back down at the bottom, right? Maybe you've made a little bit of progress. Okay, let's go back to this. So now we're talking about the water and the rock. Does somebody want to read this? Doug?
Sure. Water on the rock. Ha'azinu is Moses' valedictory song. The stammerer, whom we first encountered in the book of Exodus, has become the people's poet laureate. We read this portion each year in the midst of our soul searching and desire for repair on Shabbat Shavuot, the Sabbath of repentance and return, which falls between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The poem is didactic, a summing up of Israel's transgressions, God's power and love, and God's undying promise of divine deliverance. Moses begins with a stirring call, "Give ear, O heavens, let me speak. Let the earth hear the words I utter. May my discourse come down as the rain. May speech distill as the dew, like showers on young growth, like droplets on the grass." God enters the poem in the next two verses, in which Moses uses one of biblical poetry's stock metaphors, calling God the rock whose deeds are perfect. Rain and rock, how are we to make sense of these first verses? The common interpretation of our classical commentators is clear. Moses wants the people of Israel to receive his instructions as thirstily as the land of Israel receives rain, to embrace the Torah as life-giving and essential. Moses issues the words that are meant to touch the people. The reference to God as the rock seems to be unrelated to the rain image. It's just as common yet powerful way to describe God's unchanging steadiness and strength. But when water meets rock, both are changed. The reference suggests the hope that the waters of human prayer and yearning might touch the rock and create beauty, that our tears have impact not only here where we shed them, but in heaven. But we confess our sins before the Holy One of Blessing, not simply to remind ourselves to do better next time, but as our sages taught, to propel God from the throne of judgment to the throne of mercy. A possibility and promise, namely that the prayer that issues from the earnest human heart actually has the power to move God, especially now, especially here at the border crossing.
Thank you. So interestingly, when you hear about, you know, Moses's words, which are God's words, little by little, hitting the rock, I was initially thinking it's Moses' words, it's God's message that has to penetrate our, hard hearts or our stiff necks or whatever. But here, Rabbi David Stern turns it around and says it's our words that are trying to break through to God. So what are your thoughts about that? Jane, if you're talking, you're muted. We can't hear you.
I muted myself because the dogs came in.
Oh.
I think it's very interesting because God seems very unapproachable at times during our history. And within the last century, God has been very unapproachable. The classic example is the Holocaust, of course. So this is, to me, a very intriguing idea that my words could actually reach God. Because I always think of myself, how receptive am I to God's words? And lately it's been not very receptive at all. So I like this idea. I like the idea. In my brain, I'm already thinking, how do I play with this? How do I do this?
Well, it could be that, given, let's say, the year 2020, which has been so difficult, let's just say that maybe our prayers are about, and again, it depends on how you define God, but that we're asking God for a little more mercy next year,
Right. Well, Rabbi Kushner always said that we don't ask God, maybe if God doesn't answer our prayers, maybe the problem is we're not asking God the right question.
Absolutely true.
But
also, the mystics believe that how we are in the world as human beings has an effect on the Godhead. In other words, it's not like God, it's the opposite of Maimonides. For Maimonides, God is perfect. There's nothing that'll ever change.
Right.
But for the Kabbalists, it's sort of an interplay between us and God, and, if we're behaving badly, it's going to reflect back to God and back to us. And, maybe 2020 is a result of some of what we've done,
Do the Kabbalists believe in an evolving God, a God that evolved along with human development?
There's something called process theology. I don't know that the Kabbalists are necessarily process theologians. In other words, I think they feel like there's always some kind of balance needed, and by our behavior. I don't know if, maybe more of the modern ones, but traditionally, I don't think so. Brad Artson, who's the head of the rabbinic program at the American Jewish University, is a process theologian.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. If you want, I can see if I can dig up something and send it to you.
Oh, thank you. That would be
Sure.
very interesting, because I certainly feel that within Genesis 11 to 25, it's not just Abraham and Sarah who are evolving, and Abraham, I feel, evolves the most. But I also feel God is changing within that story, that it's a real getting to know you story. And, I don't have a feeling of solidity about God, especially the God we meet in Exodus and Deuteronomy, etc.
So you should definitely read Jack Miles's book called God, a Biography. Have you ever read that?
That book. I started it like when it first came out. I never finished it.
It's really good. It's looking at God as a literary character, because after all, we wrote it, right?
Yeah.
And it's how we understand God. And so he looks at God as an evolving character in the Bible. So I think he has a master's
list.
What's that?
I'll move it to the top of the list.
I'm always afraid when I say it that I'm going to say it's called God, an autobiography, but it's not a biography. So yeah, it's really, really a very good book, I think. I read it a long time ago, but.
Yeah.
Who's the author, Rabbi?
His name is Jack Miles, Miles. I think he has a master's like in divinity or something like that, and he was a
Taught at
journalist.
Claremont Divinity School.
Yeah.
He taught at Claremont.
Oh, okay. And then
Yeah.
he also was a journalist. So
Oh.
he has those two backgrounds.
Mm.
So he writes in a very readable way. It's not like you have to, have a big academic background to understand it.
Jane, and you had brought up an interesting concept of an evolving God. Although from the course that Jane and I recently took together, a lot of concepts are not true. And you bring up metaphors and
Yeah, well,
unreal-
again,
the,
if you think God is a guy
fiction
on
of the Bible,
I'm sorry?
what I call the fiction of the Bible,
Right.
rather than nonfiction. But I've always thought, or was, an old take, that you try and live up to God, that he's the ideal.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you bring up an evolving God.
Yeah. Well, I guess, first of all, it depends on what we mean by evolving, what it means by God, we mean by God. If it's, as I said, for Maimonides, God is just thought thinking itself about thought. I mean, it's really abstract. In Judaism, and Jane, you said you think of God as, not very approachable. I mean, in Judaism, there's this idea that God is transcendent and thus really unknowable and unreachable and immanent, which means that, we also have an ability to have a personal relationship with God. And that actually is what the Kabbalists say as well, because the Sfirot, the emanations of God, are sort of the way we might be able to experience God on earth. But then there's a part of God called Ein Sof, without ending, which is totally unknowable. So it's sort of two faces, of God in a sense. But everything they talk about, it has to be metaphor. It's not like when we lay out the Sfirot in that, 10 circle scheme. I mean, that God doesn't look like that. It's just a way to try to speak about something that really is very hard to articulate.
Don't the Kabbalists really emphasize, though, that like if we introduce too much severity in the world, then we push that up to God, and then it can force God to be more severe.
Yes.
So that there is a sense that we are influencing, and that we need to balance it with loving kindness as a way of helping to keep God in balance, that our actions push out and do. So there's definitely, as I would say, in the Kabbalistic sense, the idea that God can be changed.
Oh yeah. Oh no, I have no argument with that whatsoever. But the question was whether or not it was process theology of, God evolving to a place as opposed to God being influenced by us. They're not completely the same concept.
So there's another thing, though, that that came to mind with this reading. In some of my introductory Musar groups, there's a contemplation we do where you picture a drop of water slowly. I mean, you close your eyes, you imagine this. You watch a drop of water slowly landing on a rock, and you start visualizing the tiny displacement of just a little couple grains of sand off the top of the rock. And then you try to accelerate the contemplation so that you see a hole slowly forming until the water has drilled a hole all the way through the rock over millennia, right? But it gives you this contemplation, this image that one piece at a time can still push a change through a rock, right? Even so, if you imagine your heart as that rock and you think there's no way I'm getting through that, well, yes, even a drop of water can make a hole through a rock, and you have the ability to make that change. And it comes back to what you were saying about the blessings. Like you were saying, you do 100 a day, it builds gratitude. Each one of those is a droplet, and it can start to make a penetration and can make that hole. So I think these things all come together.
Yeah, thank you. And speaking of droplets, we also know how little droplets can affect us these days with COVID, right? A new word that we never used to use all the time, droplets, like hanging chads. Remember those? Okay, so I'm gonna go back to we have to go back to the text now and read a little more. Okay, so we just read the first few verses. Does somebody want to read some of this?
Is it
I
start
will.
with
Where-
chapter
where are
5?
we? Chapter 32, verse 5.
Oh, I'll read some
Okay,
for you.
thank you.
They are corrupt and not his children. To their shame, they are a warped and crooked generation. Is this the way you repay the Lord, you foolish and unwise people? Is he not your father, your creator, who made you and formed you? Remember the days of old, consider the generations long past. Ask your father and he will tell you, your elders, and they will explain to you. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance. In a desert
Sorry.
in a desert land he found him, in a barren and howling waste. He shielded him and cared for him. He guarded him as the apple of his eye. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, that spreads its wings to catch them and carries them aloft. The Lord alone led him. No foreign god was with him. He made him ride on the heights of the land and fed him with the fruit of the fields. He nourished him with honey from the rock and with oil from the flinty crag, with curds and milk from herd and flock, and with fattened lambs and goats, with choice rams of Bashan and the finest kernels of wheat. You drank the foaming blood of the grape. Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. Filled with food, they became sleek and heavy. They abandoned the God who made them and rejected the rock, their savior. They made him jealous with their foreign gods and angered him with their detestable gods. They sacrificed to false gods, which are not God, gods they had not known, gods that recently appeared, gods your ancestors did not fear. You deserted the rock who fathered you. You forgot the God who gave you birth.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll stop there for right now. So what is Moses saying here about God and the people?
He's saying exactly what happened, which is that the people forgot God.
Exactly.
And what we learned in this class is that the Bible becomes a coherent whole after the destruction of the first temple, when the first temple is destroyed and the people of Jerusalem are taken to Babylon, as well as in 722 with the destruction of the 10 tribes of Israel with the Assyrian conquest. So we have talked about this in this class in Torah study about how, Moses is predicting things that he couldn't possibly have known. And it's because the redactors have taken all of these stories and pulled them together. And this is when we get this concept of the Bible as a Bible. So it makes sense to me that he's saying this because a redactor is actually saying this and has witnessed this and has been part of this type of destruction.
Okay, good. But
That's the historical point of view.
It's also saying something more, I think, eternal than just, well, the whole history of Israel that's in the section called the Prophets is about, the country of Israel, the country of Judea, constantly going after other gods. Part of it is that they keep getting conquered by other empires who impose their gods on them, but they're, but aside from that, that's historically true, at least according to whoever wrote this, that the people keep, do not keep faith with our God, and they go after idols and all of that. But aside from that, there's, I think, a deeper sort of truth about human beings.
I think human beings take the easy way out.
Yes, they
You
certainly
know,
do.
I mean, following one God, I'm going to make this huge jump. All we've been reading about in the last few weeks is the threat to democracy. And the post-election has turned out to be more threatening
Yes.
than the period before the election. I mean, the election is supposed to be a democratic process. And it's this same thing. Democracy is very fragile. I mean, it could break apart, honest to God, in a nanosecond, I think. I don't think it's that strong in this country.
So that, yeah.
And it's the same thing. It's so much easier to worship something you can see, to get rewards back from the priests of the pagan temple, to not have to make sacrifices of your very best lamb and your best, roses or food or whatever. Worshiping our God is very, very hard. And
So
there are times when you just want to say,
yeah,
I don't want to do this anymore.
well, you're making some very
Polite
good
way of
points.
saying that.
You're making some very good points and some good comparisons to today. As a matter of fact, I was sitting in on a class that was taught by Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller. He was the director of the Hillel at UCLA. I think he's retired, but doing guest teaching sessions. And he was showing us the whole thing about Hanukkah, the miracle of the oil, right?
Mhm.
I hope I'm not saying anything to burst anybody's bubble, but the oil story is made up. It didn't really happen. It was a military victory. Now, the rabbis brought in the story of the oil to de-emphasize the military victory for reasons that we can go into. But the point is, Maimonides is not a believer in miracles. That's Rambam, Maimonides from the 12th century Spain. As I said, he thinks that God is basically the great intellect, thought thinking about thought. And he definitely does not believe in miracles. However, there's a passage where he talks about what happened and, in the laws of Hanukkah, like here are the laws and here's how it came to be. He does mention God and the miracle in that. And the reason for that is, and this is Chaim Seidler-Feller, not me, but if we think that everything we've done is because of us, it was our power that made this happen, then we get arrogant and we become corrupt. That's why gratitude is so important. So here, here are these ingrates, like God, there's these beautiful images of God as an eagle taking care of his young or her young. And, how beautifully we were taken care of, how we were saved from the desert, the howling wasteland. And what do? We get fat, lazy, and corrupt, right? And this is something that Moses predicted already in another part of Deuteronomy. Now it's in a more poetic form. But this is what human beings do, right? I mean, it's hard to remember. Let's say you were very poor and somehow you managed to become very wealthy one day. It's hard to remember the people you left behind and the life you left behind, and to say, you know what, this was hard. And I had certain privileges and help that other people might not have. So it's really important to have gratitude. It's really important to remember God in whatever sense you understand that, but that's something beyond yourself. As Barack Obama said, you didn't build that, part of a larger web, right? So, and that's something that these people forgot. Remember, in the beginning of Deuteronomy, we read about the Birkat Hamazon, the prayer to thank God for food, because we're going to come in, we're going to grow the food and say, hey, look what we can do. But we have to remember, hey, it's not all us, however you understand it.
Rabbi, it kind of reminded me, I have a friend who does, it's part of a German language thing where we teach German, but it's these interviews that they do on the streets in Germany. And recently, in between lockdowns, they did one where they were just randomly interviewing people on the street. And the question, which is posed in German to Germans, is what do you think that capitalism is beneficial to Germany? And this is in Berlin, and that's why it's so interesting, because what they weren't, all this is a language activity. It's for people to have these authentic interviews and then to be able to teach the vocabulary later. But what they weren't expecting is that almost everybody said, no, capitalism is not good for Berlin, until they got to somebody who was a little bit older. And when they responded, they said, it's so complex because this city has been divided.
Mhm.
But so often we forget the things that we used to have and the things we used to even think about and what was important to find where we are today. And so it's very easy to dismiss things and to lose sight. And I thought that there was so much depth in that as well, because it's different when you're sitting here in the moment, which we're supposed to be in the moment. We're supposed to be present. But at the same time, we still have stuff from before and different experiences we've had from before, and how that relates specifically to our relationship with God or within our community or anything, I think is an interesting statement. And that, again, just it had nothing to do with any of this, but it does, because
it does. It does.
so much of our time, if we think about things right now and answer things right now, it can be so different, even looking back and not so far distance in the past. So
No, absolutely. That's why the mindfulness is about trying to remember all of these things, and to remember to be grateful. But it's very hard to do. We're all very busy, and we're all into accomplishing what we set out to do, as opposed to just being, speaking of existential issues. So let's read, oh, that's not the one I want. This one about ingrates. From Ephraim, this is Bookwald. Okay, so who would like to read this?
I will.
Jason? Okay, thank you.
Which one, Jason or me?
No, go ahead, Sherry. Yeah.
Oh, okay. God spared no effort caring for his people, carrying them on the pinions of his wings and making them ride on the heights of the land. He gave the people to eat of the ripe fruits of the field, and drew for them honey from a stone and oil from a flinty rock. He fed them butter of cattle and milk of sheep, with the fat of lambs. He served them wheat as broad as kidneys and gave them to drink delicious wine from the blood of grapes. Instead of showing gratitude, Israel rebelled. Deuteronomy 32.
Just read the English here.
Yeah, Israel rebelled, became fat and kicked. You became fat, you became thick, and you became corpulent, and deserted God, its maker, and was contemptuous of the rock of its salvation. The wisest of all men, King Solomon, in Proverbs, do not give me poverty or wealth. Great poverty can prevent a person from thinking properly, driving that person away from the Almighty, whereas great wealth can also lead to apostasy, allowing one to attribute one's success to one's own talents rather than to heaven.
I'll move it down a bit.
Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch notes this is the first time that the Torah describes Israel with the title Jeshurun, derived from the word for upright, straight, and just. When the people of Israel entered the land of Israel, Israel was at the height of its calling, enjoying God's loving gifts. Even though Israel stood at its highest level of spirituality, once they began to glory in their success and became haughty, they started to reject God, attributing all their success to themselves and to their own powers. The Sforno suggests that when the nation's leaders, its elite members, pursued the physical pleasures and grew fat, thick, and corpulent, the nation as a whole deserted God and showed only contempt for him, says the Sforno.
Sforno is an Italian commentator.
When the greats stray just a little, the commoners fall into a steep decline. Boy, is that true of what's going on today?
Yeah, absolutely on point.
126 representatives suing.
I know, it's unbelievable.
Well, it's even with the COVID virus with Trump. If he had said this is dangerous, put your mask on, everybody stay home for 3 weeks, we'd be in a totally different situation.
Right. But yeah, the thing about, the 106 members of Congress, who clearly are don't seem to value our democracy too much. Well, you know, they're rich and powerful at this point. So what do they care what happens to the rest of us? I mean, look, something like close to 20 million people are going to get eviction notices at the end of the month. I mean, because they're on the edge of not being able to pay the rent, and the waiver is going to run out at the end of December, you know, where they're not allowed to evict people. And by the way, even if they can evict them, I mean, even if they don't evict them, these renters all owe back rent, which they cannot pay. And we're not doing anything to help these people, right? It's what, December 12th today?
Mm-hmm.
Have they passed anything?
No.
So, you know, when it's the interest of the very wealthy, it's easy to forget those that you leave behind. And it's very easy to lose track of, you know, how to behave decently in the world, unfortunately. Any other
It
comments?
seems to me that King Solomon is a great proponent of the middle class.
Yeah.
Be in the middle. Not poor, you're not rich, you're just so-so.
Right. Well, that would be a general Jewish thing, I think. Although, you know what? No, I was talking to somebody yesterday who's interested in converting.
Mhm.
And I was asking her why. And she said, you know, she grew up around Jews, and, you know, Jews are really smart and they're really good with business. And I'm thinking, oh dear.
Oh my
dear.
God, that's a stereotype.
I know. And I was thinking, okay, I've got to be able to tell her, look, that's not
Don't say
cool.
that.
Yeah. But I didn't want to do it immediately. So, okay, let's read a little more of the Deuteronomy. Here we are in verse 19. And would somebody like to read? Jason?
I will.
Okay, Sandy.
The Lord saw this and rejected them because he was angered by his sons and daughters. I will, excuse me. I will hide my face from them, he said, and see what their end will be. For they are a perverse generation, children who are unfaithful. They made me jealous by what is no good. No, excuse me, by what is no God, and angered me with their worthless idols. I will make them envious by those who are not a people. I will make them angry by a nation that has no understanding, for a fire will be kindled by my wrath, one that burns down to the realm of the dead below. It will devour the earth and its harvests, and set afire the foundations of the mountains. I will heap calamities on them and spend my arrows against them. I will send wasting famine against them, consuming pestilence and deadly plague. I will send against them the fangs of wild beasts, the venom of vipers that glide in the dust. In the street, the sword will make them childless. In their homes, terror will reign. The young men and young women will perish, the infants and those with gray hair. I said I would scatter them and erase their name from human memory, but I dreaded the taunt of the enemy, lest the adversary misunderstand and say, our hand has triumphed, the Lord has not done all this.
Okay.
They are a nation without sense. There is no discernment in them. If only they were wise and would understand this and discern what their end will be. How could one man chase 1,000 or two, put 10,000 to flight, unless their rock had sold them, unless the Lord had given them up? For their rock is not our rock. And even as our enemies concede, their vine comes from the vine of Sodom and from the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are filled with poison and their clusters with bitterness. Their wine is the venom of serpents, the deadly poison of cobras. Have I not kept this in reserve and sealed it with my faults? It is mine to avenge. I will repay. In due time, their foot will slip. Their day of disaster is near, and their doom rushes upon them.
Okay, let's stop there. Just this is pretty nasty stuff, right?
It reminds me of some of the Christian preachers that say that all the horrible things that are happening in the world are because of homosexuality or abortion or whatever they choose to say at the time.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, this is where, you know,
This
The
is
God
where
of
they
the
got-
so-called Old Testament gets a bad reputation. It's pretty horrible, right? God's
Is
gonna-
this
and
where
this
they
is-
get it from? It is
Ah.
horrible.
Yeah, well, there's some stuff in the Christian Bible too that, but there's a lot. I mean, this is not the first time we've read this, right? I mean, the book of Deuteronomy has a lot of blessings and curses. And remember, there's a whole paragraph that is part of the Shema that we as a Reform movement took out because it was so offensive. If you don't obey my commandments, the sky will dry up and you'll starve to death. And, only if you're good will it rain and you'll get food. So, and, we've read about, the cities being under siege and people are going to start eating their afterbirth. And, I mean, it's really horrible. So, what do you do with texts like this? Well, you could take it and say, the wrath of God will come descend upon you if you don't obey what you're supposed to do. Or you could say, well, this is a very problematic text in our tradition. We acknowledge that it's there. We don't ignore it. We problematize it. And then we try to put it into historical context. Like this, is how people understood God at that time. And that's not the God that we believe in now, I hope, because this is all punishment. It's not just natural disasters. And then we try to maybe understand it metaphorically. If you don't get rid of the idols in yourself, right? The need to have, the latest fancy Mercedes or BMW or a really very expensive home or whatever it is that people need to have to show that they matter. These are not the things that really matter. But once you get
last
that,
iPhone, the latest.
Yeah. All of these things that we, that people feel they need. Yes, Sherry, go ahead.
I have a question. What do you say to converts about things like these passages?
Well, I say it's the same thing I say to converts as I say to Jews, who are born Jewish. As I said, there's several levels. One is to say it's in here. Yes. And we all have difficult passages. I don't care. I mean, I'm sure the Quran has some stuff that is not so wonderful either. There's material in the New Testament, so it's not like we're the only ones, but let's not pretend we don't have this. And then you have to say, we reject the plain meaning of this text. And we're a rabbinic religion anyway. We're not a biblical religion. We go with how the rabbis understand the material. So even though it'll say an eye for an eye, we actually don't do that. If you happen to knock my eye out, I'm not going to come over and rip yours out. I'm going to have to pay you pain and suffering, medical care, loss of work, those kinds of things. That's how it was developed by the Talmud. So again, if you take it literally, then it's really offensive.
It's interesting I asked because Shell's mother, who was Jewish, rejected Judaism because she thought that it was a biblical, vengeful God, and she wanted nothing to do with it, and she became an atheist.
Okay. Well, again,
because of those kind of passages.
You know what? She's not the only one. And, the question is, what do you do? Look, if you're a feminist and you read this, you're going to feel like you're missing from here in many ways, right? So you can reject the tradition, say, I am done with Judaism, or you can try to change it and bring in other voices and say, okay, well, we don't have too many voices in here, but first of all, let's lift up the voices that we do have in here. For example, has anyone here heard of Huldah? Okay, Huldah is a prophetess who, when this particular scroll, the scroll of Deuteronomy, was discovered under King Josiah, Huldah authenticated it. She was the one who said, this is really the word of God. So you lift up voices like that are, kind of lost in translation, or even the matriarchs are all pretty powerful women. I mean, look what Rebecca does. She makes sure that Jacob gets the blessing of the firstborn. So you lift up those voices, you bring in women's midrash. I'm sure many of you have read The Red Tent. That was a sort of more popular version of a midrash, right? Let's get it from Dina's perspective, because it was written by the men. I mean, assuming this is a real story, but
Right.
it was written by some men who, were angry and felt their honor was hurt. Well, what did Dina feel? How did she think about this whole thing. You unearth other material. For example, even though it looks like these societies are patriarchal and women aren't allowed to own anything, they found in the Elephantine documents, which is from Egypt, they found documents showing that women were the presidents of synagogues, I think also in Israel. And the Elephantine papers are actually about divorces that were initiated by women. So, you try to infuse the tradition with other material and another perspective, and you try to redeem the material that way. But
She should have met you.
What's that?
She should have met you.
Oh, well, can I tell you that, this is from studying with some wonderful women at Hebrew Union College. So yeah, Dr. Rachel Adler, Dr. Tamara Eskenazi, they're all, really wonderful. Ruth, you're muted. It's a little microphone on the bottom. Okay, I'll tell you what, we'll go on, and then when you unmute yourself will stop, okay? Let's see if I can find a handout. Okay. God's hidden face. Doug, you want to read this, or Jason? Who would like to?
I'm going to give it to Jason. I'm having, my computer keeps freezing. So.
Oh, okay. I'm going to just make it a little darker here.
Okay.
Hopefully easier to read. Okay. Jason, you mind?
Okay. Sure. My God's face, Azinu, the concept of Hester Panim appears again. It appeared in as Moses warns the people that God will hide his face from them when they stray. He said, I will see what their changes. They are not recognizable as my children whom I have reared. Rashi explains that the text is a lack of faithfulness of the people to the divine. Although the simple meaning relates to straying after false gods, I believe the implication referring to the moral teachings of the Torah, particularly the pursuit of justice. This is the basic criticism of most of the later prophets in explaining the exile predicted as punishment here by Moshe. Regardless of God's presence, Ramban Nachmanides referred to is the departure of the divine presence, the Shekinah, from among the people. That is the caring feminine aspect of the divine. It also appears in the psalm we traditionally add to our between Rosh Hashanah and the end of Sukkot. One thing I ask of the Lord that I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, that he will hide me in his tabernacle on the day of calamity. He will conceal me in the secrecy of his tent. Do not hide your presence from me. Do not turn your servant away for my help me, O God of my salvation.
Oh dear. Okay, thank you. You were a little bit in and out, but I think we could follow, right? This is basically focusing on, straying from God. What does that actually mean? What does it really mean to stray after false gods? That it's about justice to a great extent, which, is really what we all came to when we looked at how this related to today. And, one of the ways of explaining, let's say, the Holocaust is that God's face was hidden for one reason or another. And that's not an explanation that goes very far. But that is one of the ways in which the tradition understands, calamities that might not be necessarily punishments directly, or maybe they are, and God is just waiting for you to get punished and to learn your lesson. But it's the idea of God not being there. Yeah, go ahead, Sandy.
Well, I was just wondering, is it possible? You were talking about the Holocaust, and I look at the Holocaust and how horrible, horrible, horrible it was, and yet it resulted in the state of Israel in a lot of ways. And I wonder if that wasn't God's intention. It's a horrible way to look at it, I think.
No, I don't think so.
You would sacrifice 6 million. This
I
is
don't
why
think
people
so.
don't believe in God. Would God sacrifice 6
Well, that's
million
why I said
people
it was-
just to establish the state of
No.
Israel?
No,
I don't believe that.
that's why I said it was so, that's why I said it was so horrible.
Yes, yes, you're right.
I'm sure there are people who think that, right?
Mhm.
But, you know,
Can we
Hester
take a
Panim,
slightly, can we take a slightly different perspective on it and say, not everything is pure good and pure evil, right? Say that at least one good thing emerged even from a horrible event. So we don't have to say that the evil thing led to or was part of a trade, but we can say that we didn't know the end of the story. And the story has progressed to where there is a modern state of Israel that made possible. It doesn't mean that we had to have one for the other, but we can also know that it's part of a continuing story, and it's not, and we don't have all the information, right? We
But
don't
look at-
have the knowledge of cause and effect, but we can see that it possibly would not have happened were it not for the other. And so we can acknowledge that some benefit did in fact arise, even if it wasn't causation that was forced on us from a divine presence, but just from the course of events. I think you can look at it and still appreciate that a good thing can happen from a bad thing. There's a video, a TED Talk about this woman who talks about how the brain tumor she got was the best thing that ever happened to her. And you would think, how impossible is that? But she talks about how her family was fractured and it brought everyone together and it resulted in a lot of reunion and joy, and it brought things that could never have been possible without the brain tumor. It's not that you want a brain tumor, but had it, she was able to
Jason.
see that good things resulted.
Jason, it's the story of Hanukkah, and it's the story again and again and again of the Jewish people coming back, even when things look very bleak. And I personally, you know, having really not experienced the Holocaust as a lot of people have, but having been there as part of it, I don't think that is what caused Israel to come. Israel came because it should be there. And Israel does things that are not always the right things either, but it's still an important, such an important place. And this is the way that life is. And we've heard this story again and again and again through the millennium. And we'll be there because we're going to try and make it a better world. And we're going to try, no matter what happens, to do our little bit. Maybe it's not enough. It's never enough. But I don't think that Israel is there because of the Holocaust. And Sherry, the thing that I said when I got lost is, look at Shell after his mother believed the way she did. I mean, he was so spiritual and such an amazing man. Are you still there, Sherry?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, so you
Well,
know.
he may have gotten it from his father, who was very religious and
Mm.
spiritual. So, you know,
Okay, but
it's
anyway,
not in a
that's
vacuum.
comment.
Well,
Because
look, I don't like this God either. And I don't believe in this particular God myself. It's again, you have to remember who wrote this. We're not Orthodox. We believe that the Bible is written by human beings, and this is how they understood God. And, you know, it may have also been a vehicle for keeping people in line, right?
Mhm.
Right.
You know, if consequences aren't really dire, maybe people are just going to go do all the things that they're not supposed to do, and they do them anyway,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
We know that just because you punish someone doesn't mean they're not going to go ahead and do the bad thing. You know,
But
it's sort of like
Rabbi,
yeah.
what do we do about this verse? I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be, for they are a generation of changes. They are not recognizable as my children whom I have reared. So it seems to me that there's a double abandonment.
Mhm.
The people abandon God, and God abandons his people.
Right. Well, abandons,
But,
subjects them to other, you know, forces.
yeah, but, and maybe it's me because I came to Judaism so late, but somehow in my head, I have this idea that God is always available, that all I have to do is reach out and speak to him. After all, what is prayer for except to speak to God? So now this is telling me God may not listen to you.
Well, it's certainly, well, in this case, God is not listening because God is saying, hey, you were so bad. I'm now going to punish you and I'm going to hide my face. So I don't, like, sort of like Hagar not wanting to look at her son.
Right, right.
And so,
but it goes against this basic principle. And I think it's a principle of both Judaism and Christianity, which is that you don't need priests, you don't need any intercessors. You can speak directly to God. How do you know God is hearing you?
well, that's a whole other story.
Well, let's say we generally right now, we live in a really crappy society. If I were God, I would turn my back on this society. Hello, don't punish me.
Well, unfortunately,
I believe in what these people believe in. I don't act this way.
Right. Well, remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where God says to Abraham, I'm going to destroy the cities.
Exactly.
And remember, Abraham argues, what if there are 50 righteous people? That's not fair. But he only gets down to 10. And then after 10, he stops. And there are different ways of interpreting it. But the way I've interpreted it is, if you don't have a critical mass of decent people in a society, the society is corrupt and gone. Right. So that's why as far as I'm concerned, that's why the rest of us have to suffer, because there's a lot of corruption out there in so many different ways on so many different levels. And we're part of this society. Maybe we didn't do enough to stop it. Maybe we didn't do enough to protect our democracy. We allowed these things to happen.
We have those 10 people.
I'm sorry?
We still have those 10 people.
We have
it's more than 10.
Yeah,
but what I'm saying is that's what we need to do, is we need to argue with God and say we need to get back to a good democracy.
Exactly. And that's the thing about teshuvah. And when you say, yeah, God is there, you can always do teshuvah. But unfortunately, since we are social animals, our doing teshuvah individually is not going to be enough. It has to be the whole society. For example, facing up to our past as Americans, the fact that we took land from the Native Americans, that we enslaved Black people. I mean, those are things that, Germany at least spent a lot of time facing its past. We haven't. We barely acknowledged that we had any responsibility for any of this, right? Germany paid reparations. We've never paid reparations for what we've done to Black people and to Native Americans.
And we still have Confederate statues honoring.
We have Confederate statues. We have white supremacists running around with AK-47s, wanting to kidnap the governor of Michigan and giving death threats to people because they were, running a voting system. I mean, so unfortunately, it's very hard if you don't have a critical mass, and we definitely don't have the critical mass right now. Yeah, 10 is a symbolic number, it's a million, but it's a symbolic number to mean that there's a community.
But apparently we had enough critical mass in this last election to bring about what at least I wanted to happen. I realized that 72 million people didn't believe what I did, but 79 million people did. And, it's been very, very depressing. I mean, I just did not believe, I really did not believe that Trump would lose. I really did not, because.
Right. And we got very close, and we're not out of it yet.
Oh, we are not.
Monday.
When he tells the legislature, the Congress to, select their own people.
And those people are not going away.
Nope. They're not
exactly.
going
away. And they're a critical mass that's going to stop everything that we want to happen. This doesn't end with the election.
Right.
Mitch McConnell is the most powerful man in Washington, D.C. right now. And he alone, just him by himself.
That's right.
Is stopping everything. One man against millions.
Yep. So, we skated very close to becoming an authoritarian country. We're not out of the woods. And even if, let's say, January 20th, Biden is, sworn in, 4 years from now, somebody might do it better than they did it this last time.
Please say when and not if.
Yeah, when. But I'm
And
going
more
up.
people didn't vote for more people at all than voted for either of the candidates.
Right.
So you
That's
talk
so
about it.
when we're saying we
people-
didn't take responsibility, we didn't, right? Because we have to get out there and vote, and we have to get out there and make sure that our democracy is safe.
My husband David says that Trump is not the problem. It was Congress that allowed him and enabled him to do
Yes.
all of the things that he wanted, because he gave them what they wanted, the abortion and the Supreme Court and all the judges, and they were willing to overlook what an evil person he was.
And listen, were it not for a few Republican voting officials saying, no, we are not going to break the law and do something that is being demanded of us, we wouldn't even be here right now.
And the Supreme Court actually did what they're supposed to do.
Uh-huh.
Was it yesterday? And it's like, I'm slowly getting a little bit of faith. I just wish McConnell would go away, because he's actually worse.
So let's go back to our commentary a little bit. I don't want to get into too much politics, because this is going to be up on the web, and okay, so people know that this group of people is filled with Democrats. Okay, we were talking about God and change. So let's see about that. See then now that I am he, there's no God beside me. Okay, I'm sorry for all these he's for God. I was always told never, ever call God he. And I usually try to fix it, but when some of this is people's, writing, so I don't like to change people's writing. Okay, the Hatam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Schreiber, raised his eyebrows at this verse. Why is the word I in Hebrew ani repeated twice? Remember, the rabbis always, need to understand any little tiny thing that might be off. Why do you have two I's? Why does Moses use the word now in this verse? Doesn't this verse echo other biblical moments of revelation? For the young generation of Israelites gazing across the Jordan River into the land of Israel, this is the beginning of their redemption. But for Moses, the Hatam Sofer teaches, it is a moment of memory. When he started his journey, the Israelites were back in Egypt, enslaved to Pharaoh, pathetic, and in exile. God said to Moshe at the burning bush, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, I will be there, howsoever I will be there. I mean, there are a lot of different ways of translating this name for God. Ehyeh asher ehyeh. It could mean I am what I am. It could mean I will be what I will be. It could be I am what I will be, or I will be what I am, or this one, I will be there, howsoever I will be there, okay? So that makes it very difficult to pin what exactly it is. But one thing that's important to notice is it's a verb. God is not a name, but a verb. These words too double the first person pronoun I, because ehyeh, the is the I, and then again is the I. Using the future tense. So the reason it's the future tense and the reason it can be translated as present is that there is no present tense in Hebrew. So if you want to indicate the present in biblical Hebrew, you have to use the future. In modern Hebrew, you use the present participle for the present, but there is no present, which is interesting. So these words too double the first person pronoun I, using the future tense as a promise that the future redemption was certain, that the whole journey would make sense, and that Israel would one day affirm God. Now, at the end of the 40-year journey, Moses understands the meaning of those words from Exodus. Now, Moses' poem uses the present tense, ani hu. Now, again, there is no verb in there. It means I, he, sort of. But it's implied. The verb is implied in there. So I am I, or I am who I is, or something like that. God is what God said God would become. So this is process theology right here, and this is from way back. It's a moment of arrival, clarity, and joy, a moment of Moses' affirmation of God in wholeness. The promise is about to be fulfilled. The traditional commentator Ibn Ezra from Spain offers us a similar reading, referring us to Isaiah, who also spoke for God with a double form of I. Anochi, Anochi, I am I, the one who comforts you. God, Ibn Ezra teaches, does not change. Only our perceptions of God change as we travel through life. When we come to an awareness of this, we're comforted by the realization that God's awesome presence is always with us. God is. So you can either say that God is evolving or that our perception of God is evolving. And the verb to be is what God is, because ehyeh asher ehyeh is the verb to be in the future tense. And I've said that to my confirmation students because I think that changes how we understand God. Remember when Moses wants to see God face to face? God says, you cannot see me face to face. You're going to have to hide in the rock and just see my back. So what does it mean to see God's back?
Well, it's not differentiated. I mean,
Okay.
when you see a face, you see features. But when you
Okay.
see a back, like if Caesar Milan did this on The Dog Whisperer, believe it or not, where there was a dog and it was very frightened and it wouldn't come out of the cage. And what he did is he sat in front of the cage and all the dog saw was his back.
Interesting.
And so he's not seeing anything human that he associates with his fear. And he got the dog to come out of the cage.
That's really interesting. And that kind of reminds me of what somebody said about the light being too much all at once, the eighth grader, right?
Yeah, he had to wait about 15 minutes for it to happen, where the dog would actually start to approach him.
Okay, so the idea is that you don't get the full force of God because God is awesome, right?
Mhm.
And you can't take it all in. So that's great. What else does it mean to see God's back? Remember, Hebrew is very concrete and everything's written in a very concrete way. So it doesn't necessarily mean literally what is being said here. So I would say, does somebody have an idea?
Yeah, about the idea of a clean slate.
Okay.
The back is a clean slate.
Okay, good. So I would also add that if you see God's back, what you're seeing is the effect of God having been there, right? Through God's actions, like let's say taking us out of Egypt or whatever it is, the miracles that we observe in the world. So I think, yeah, that you can't see God directly. You can't know God directly. You can see the acts that God has performed in the world through us, and that's kind of an evolving matter as well. So our last commentary here is about God's vengeance. So I thought we should probably take a look at that. So Jonathan Sacks, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, calls it a sedra, which is a Torah portion. Somebody trying to say something?
I think Ruth needs to mute herself.
I'm just going to mute her right now. Okay. Okay. All right. So we have these lines that we read at the very beginning, or towards the beginning. I lift my hand to heaven and declare, etc. You know, all this vengeance that God is going to take, right? Three thinkers, Jan Assmann, the Jewish scholar Henri Atlan, and the Christian theologian Miroslav Volf, have something deeply insightful to say about divine vengeance. Assmann points out a fundamental difference between the Hebrew Bible and other ancient civilizations. In the others, the human king takes on the attributes of a god. The anger of the king is the anger of the god. The latter legitimates the former. So God is legitimating whatever the king does. And if, you know, the king does something bad, it's what their little God wanted. In avenging himself against his enemies, the king is doing God's work. Violence receives a religious sanction. In the Hebrew Bible, by contrast, there is a profound and unbridgeable distance between the human king and God. Anger is theologized and thus transferred from earth to heaven. So in other words, the use of anger, the use of vengeance is only supposed to be in God's hands. It should not be in the hands of human beings. Because theoretically, God knows how to handle it and human beings don't. Outland argues likewise, suggesting that the best way to rid the world of the violent sacred is to reject it onto a transcendence. In other words, it becomes God's realm. The transcendence of violence results in its being expelled from the normal horizon of things. In other words, vengeance is removed from human calculation. It is God, not man, who's entitled to exercise it. To be sure, there are times when God commands human beings to act on his behalf. The battles against the Midianites and the Amalekites are two obvious examples. But once prophecy ceases, as it has done since late Second Temple times, so too does violence in the name of God. Okay, I'm not going to go further right now because we're going to run out of time and I want to be able to talk about this. So how do you understand this, that it's put in God's hands as opposed to in the hands of human beings? And by the way, I think it was Jacob Arnold Wolf, another rabbi he was from Chicago, who said that the violence in the society was transferred to the priests. So the priests did the sacrifices, not anybody else in the community. So it's a way to kind of, channel the violence into something maybe sacred and not leaving it in the hands of human beings. And this is sort of a similar argument. Does that work for you?
Well, I don't want God to take, I don't want to defer the judgment on the 106 Republicans who, defended this or joined in this suit. This makes me uneasy. This paragraph makes me very uneasy. It's as if there would be, if it's in God's hand, then the punishment is in the future, which means there's no accountability or responsibility on earth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's why it makes me uneasy. I don't believe in that.
Good point. How do you hold God accountable, right?
Yeah, right. And how do you see justice done? I mean, if we're supposed to pursue justice, how do we see justice done on earth?
You vote them out of office. Oh.
I think, you know what, Shelley? Sherry, it's too long for me. I want it now. Or on January 20th, when Congress reconvenes.
Right.
I think Wolf is.
Go ahead.
Okay, I think Wolf is making a distinction between justice and violence, though, because he's talking about growing up in Croatia. If people are living in a war zone and they've been subjected to violence, that if they don't see that if they don't have any other recourse, they're going to resort to violence themselves. So if they have some idea that God is, he's arguing that violence is the privilege of people who live in nonviolence is the privilege of people who live in nonviolent societies, that people who live in societies where there's violence taken on them will seek vengeance if they don't have any other sense that there will be some sort of accountability. So justice is the best form of accountability. But if there is no justice, then if you don't tell people that God is going to take vengeance on people, then they will do it themselves.
That's a good point, because, vengeance is not necessarily what needs to happen in a war zone or anywhere, really. There are other ways, like, when South Africa ended their war, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and, people who committed horrible, crimes against humanity or whatever were also introduced to people who were their victims. And that's possibly a way to move forward rather than having a cycle of violence, because violence begets violence. But we'll read more about it next time. So we're meeting again next Saturday.
Right.
And we'll definitely finish Ha'azinu, which is a little bit longer. And then we have the actual final Torah portion, which is normally only read at Simchat Torah. But it's about all the different tribes and what's going to happen to them. And then Moses is going to die, and then we're going to be done, which I don't think, we won't be done next week, but we're going to be done really soon, which is unbelievable after 8 years or so. So
Does that mean no more Torah study?
No, absolutely
not. Does that mean no more Torah?
No, it does not mean no more Torah study. It means we maybe go on to the next book, the book of Judges, which I bet you most people haven't even, or Joshua, I mean. Joshua and Judges, I bet you few people here have actually read any of that, right?
Right.
Joshua, Judges?
No.
Well, I wonder
Read-
how many people have actually read the Bible itself, the Old
Right.
Testament. This is,
So-
a lot of this is new.
Yeah. So, yeah, when we read that, there's not going to be quite as much commentary on it as there is on the Torah, but we'll do our own. So, I mean, the only time we read from the book of the prophets is during a Haftorah reading, right? A little piece of it. We don't read the whole thing.
So what are the dates, Rabbi?
the
Do you know?
dates? Well,
For
I
the
know
Torah study.
right now, I'll tell you what I have. I still have to pick some dates beyond January, but hang on just one second.
Saturday
so,
after
okay, so-
Christmas, no? Saturday
So
after
we're
Christmas?
meeting next Saturday, the 19th.
Right.
And then we're meeting January 9th
Ah.
and 23rd. And then I will do the rest of the schedule very soon.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
So, okay, so
Not that I'm so busy.
you know what? I'm gonna just highlight this so we remember where we stopped. Here we are. Yay, okay. All right, so thank you all for your very perceptive comments.
Rabbi,
And,
is it,
yeah.
excuse me, is it possible to have the next, as you did,
Yeah, definitely. I will send it to you. But did anybody not get today's handout or needs a copy?
in other words, next week's in
course.
advance?
No,
So
I
I
will,
can read it over and
as
sort of.
soon as I have it done, I will send it to you.
You have it.
Fantastic, thank you. Toda.
So you sent today's about how many weeks ago? I can find it.
Been a couple weeks ago. If you don't
Couple.
find it, let me know and I'll send it. Anybody not get it? Or want it? Okay. Yeah,
Sure,
if you
I
don't
got it.
find it, I will send you another copy, no problem. Okay, well, everyone, Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
Enjoy Hanukkah.
Happy.
Safe travels, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Have a safe trip.
Oh,
Thank you.
have a safe trip.
Thank you.
Safe